Welcome to Advisor Talk with Frank LaRosa. Brought to you by Elite Consulting Partners, it's the only podcast offering unfiltered guidance and direct advice for all things concerning financial advisors, RIAs, and the practitioners in the wealth management business. Learn more and subscribe today at eliteconsultingpartners.com/podcast. And now, here's your host, Frank LaRosa.
Hey everybody, welcome to Advisor Talk with Frank LaRosa. I am your host, Frank LaRosa, and today's highway to the danger zone conversation. I have one of the partners at Fox Rothschild, Matt Baum. How you doing, Matt?
I'm good. How you doing, Frank? Thanks
Awesome.
for having me.
You look like Miami Vice kind of going on there.
I'm glad you picked up on that. I was going for that.
I saw that. It's good. It's pretty
and
good.
I live in New Jersey, so it really doesn't make any sense. But
that's okay. That's how we all roll, right?
Exactly.
So for those of you listening on our podcast, you should check us out on our YouTube channel, because then you can see two handsome gentlemen that are quite dapper.
We're going to swap out other people for our faces. It'll be fine.
Exactly right. Anyway, so welcome to the show. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I was super excited to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about just some danger zones, right?
Sure.
And we call it highway to the danger zone, right?
I don't know where you came up with that phrase.
Yeah, I don't know. Gee, I don't know. So I have that creative bug. So, but there's a lot of stuff happening. Obviously in financial services, always regulated, right?
Yep.
And I think that there's a couple areas that I would like to talk about in particular.
Sure.
One of them, and we'll sort of go through these, and I think that maybe you can sort of like talk about like, hey, for those of you listening, this is just a conversation amongst two people. Matt is an attorney, but this is not legal advice, and he can sort of give the disclaimer.
Yes.
To make sure you all know that neither of us, especially Matt, are not giving you legal advice. If you have questions at the end of this, what you could do, and we'll have it in the pot, and we'll have it in the links, and he'll give us your number. You give Matt a call and talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. As it relates to transitions, and this is not what this topic is going to be about, but let me just give you my sense in the audience's sense. If you're an advisor making a move, and it really doesn't matter what size practice you have, even when a firm says to you, hey, we're going to provide you some legal counsel, I still recommend you get your own legal counsel that you pay for, right? Can you just, and I know we weren't planning on talking about that.
Sure.
Can you just explain to the audience why that's so important?
Sure. And thanks for having me, Frank. And just to give the disclosures that Frank promised, this is not investment advice, tax advice, legal advice. Our conversation is for informational and general purposes only. Should not be relied on in any way. This does not create an attorney-client privilege. If you want to receive legal advice, you need to retain an attorney and get advice from that attorney. So that's the premise of our discussion today. And this conversation may constitute attorney advertising. I'll throw that disclaimer in there as well.
Oh, it's a fancy one.
Well, why not? So in any event, going back to the issue that you had raised.
If a firm that is hiring an advisor provides them, I would say provides them a conversation, but they have a conversation with an attorney that the firm's going to pay for.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what firm.
Yep.
My recommendation has always been that, and the bigger the practice, the even more important it is, right? Or if you're coming from a W-2 firm, it's even more important that you have your own representation. So you can still work with the firm attorney that they're recommending, but I always believe you should have your own attorney, and I thought maybe you could just sort of dive into, briefly why you feel that's important.
Yeah, happy to. So first and foremost, Frank, as you know, the attorney's number one ethical obligation is to zealously represent their client and their client's interests. So if I'm wearing two hats, I represent Frank, but I also represent Elite Consulting, there's a potential conflict that could arise there. Whose rights, whose benefits am I most concerned about? Whose interests am I most defending? Now, lawyers should take their ethical obligations seriously, and I've absolutely worked on joint representations where I will represent both an advisor and the house, so to speak, the firm, whether it's an RIA firm, broker-dealer, et cetera. And in certain instances, that makes complete sense. In other instances, however, I agree with you completely. Having your own counsel gives you a singular voice, and you can get more comfort in working with someone who you know is your counsel, not your counsel plus someone else's
paid
counsel.
by somebody else.
Exactly, and there's nothing untoward with that, and it could be completely appropriate, but in certain instances, I agree with you completely. You want your own advocate. You want your own cheerleader. You want your own voice that's not theoretically or potentially tainted by another influence.
Right. Exactly. So that actually brings us up to the first sort of danger zone area, and we're doing a lot of M&A work. So one of the companies that we have called Elite Advisor Successions, where we're helping just really connect buyers and sellers.
Yep.
Right. We don't get involved in the legal contracts. We don't get involved in evaluations. We're really just matching them up. Right.
Yep.
And what we've seen sometimes is the seller, in most cases, is just taking the buyer's contract. So they come to terms, right?
Yep.
That's a whole nother topic for conversation. But they come to terms, and the buyer puts together a contract and gives it to the seller.
Yep.
And the seller, getting maybe enamored with the deal, maybe jumps too quickly and or doesn't get their own counsel, right?
Yep.
And so I wanted to talk for a few minutes about, if you're a seller in particular, what are the things that you've seen that really create problems that you should be looking out for?
How much time do you have, Frank?
Yeah, no, exactly.
So we're very involved in that space as well. I'm working on several live transactions right now in the M&A space. And buyers and sellers often have some aligned interests, but also some very different interests, right? A seller theoretically wants to get maximum amount of dollars, fewest restrictions possible, et cetera. Buyer, it's kind of the opposite. You want to pay as little as possible and get the most value you can get. That's a little bit too broad-based and too stereotypical because actually at the end of the day, the fit, the alignment of the buyer and the seller, the alignment of the practices becomes paramount, and it goes beyond just dollars and cents.
Right.
And I'm sure we're going to hit that theme as we go through some other topics today.
Yeah.
But on a high level, I think that one of the biggest pitfalls that I'm seeing in M&A is material components of the transaction not being addressed in the documents at all. So if I take my boilerplate asset purchase agreement or my boilerplate consulting agreement that might go along with the deal, that may not address something that's very important to the buyer or to the seller, right? So maybe if I'm selling my practice, I have a child, and that child's in my practice. And it's very important to me that my child has a home at this place for some period of time. Maybe it's important to me that that child has an opportunity to buy the business back one day. Are those terms addressed in the documents? If they're not, you could have a big problem.
Yeah.
I worked with a managing partner of a law firm years ago who used to say this is Wall Street, not Sesame Street. And if it's not in the documents, you may have a big problem one day saying, well, I relied on the fact that they told me that this could happen. My sales assistant could come over. My team of 3 could come over. Is it in the documents? So the biggest pitfall is actually what's usually not even there.
Right.
So working off of boilerplate gets you boilerplate results. It doesn't get you curated custom results that you would look for typically in your deal.
How do you, when doing deals, it's a lot of kumbaya. They're excited. Both parties are excited.
Yeah.
Hopefully, right? When you find the match and the fit and all that other stuff, right? And the seller finds the right buyer that's going to take care of their clients, all that good stuff.
Yep.
How do you, whether it's an attorney or how should the seller approach some of these topics without turning a enjoyable experience into a contentious experience? Because that's where we've seen deals fall apart.
100%. I think it's a good analogy in this space is almost think of a prenup, right? Most people who get married.
I wasn't going to say it, but yeah.
Yeah, they want to get married. They're in love. They can't imagine life without one another. And unfortunately, when you look at divorce rates in this country, it's pretty high. You could flip a coin pretty much as to whether that marriage is going to work or not.
Right.
The prenup often becomes a very sensitive topic that folks don't want to talk about because that's the business of the relationship. Here, we're in business. This is a business transaction, right? And so we need to treat it that way. If both sides are being transparent with their goals, their interests, their concerns, then that part should be easy. It's if a party is trying to obfuscate some components of what they're looking to do, isn't revealing some of their intentions with the business, whether they're selling it, buying it, or otherwise, or how they're going to participate, that you can then have problems. So to me, if I'm dealing with a counterparty who's shutting down or getting angry or getting emotional, that's a red flag. I want to now think through that. Now, if you've got one party that's just being a total pain and is raising every little tiny issue and every semicolon in the agreement, that's not practical either, and that's not going to work. There has to be some trust embedded going in. You have to like the people. You have to feel like there's a fit. That's the first step, right? Not the money.
Right.
etc.
Right. So do you feel like communicating that at the very beginning of a process with a buyer and a seller, that it's the seller's responsibility to bring that up, and it's the seller's responsibility in a positive way to really talk about when this doesn't go right? So when I was a branch manager, and I would have this is sort of the same, but it's similar. And I would have two buddies come into my office, and I say buddies because they were, they used to go to lunch every day and all this other stuff, and they come back in and be like, "We want to be partners, right? We're going to combine our practices." And I was like, "Hold on, love the idea on the surface, but let's fast forward 4 years from now, when one of you guys is not working as hard as the other guy, and you come in and say, we hate each other and we want to split up.
Exactly.
How do we split up that book of business?
Yep.
Right? That was my responsibility to help them walk through that stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes they ended up saying, you know what, let's just be buddies.
Right.
Right? And we'll just maybe share some clients and whatever.
Yep.
Whose responsibility is it with an M&A transaction to bring up or have those conversations? And I guess what's the process from a seller's perspective to think about all that stuff, right? Because there's so many scenarios that they have to think about. So what have you seen that has worked well where a transaction for the seller sort of like lived up to what they wanted?
So I think the onus is on both sides. Takes two to tango, to use a cliche line, right? This has to be a harmony, because if you're buying the practice, you need that advisor to be enthusiastic about the seller to be enthusiastic about that transaction, help you transition that client base over, which is what you're buying, these relationships, this opportunity to have more assets under management, more revenues, more clients, et cetera. And you want that person to be part of it and have a vested interest and want to have a good attitude about it, just like the buyer wants to make sure they're getting someone who's the right fit. The seller wants to make sure that they're bringing their clients to a place that makes sense for their client base as well.
Right.
Because, we hear about client segmentation. We hear about private equity coming behind deals where perhaps they want to change how business is conducted in the business.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of sellers get remorse pretty quickly, saying, oh, they're going to raise the fee on Mrs. Jones. She's my next door neighbor. She's a nice elderly woman. I could never do that to her. And private equity is going to say, it's not your decision anymore. We own this asset, and it's no issue with Mrs. Jones, but there's a business, and we're trying to improve the revenues and do certain things.
Right.
So you want to have an honest conversation between both, amongst the parties. Make sure you're going in the right direction. Another mistake that I see all the time, and this goes to your point of people using boilerplate documents and not really negotiating them, is choreographing that transition process. Instead of some generic language, which sometimes you see of you're going to act in good faith to, help transition the business, you might want to think about choreography. Well, my process is I walk them through this analysis. I do this plan. I do this. I do that as the buyer.
As a buyer, right.
I want the seller to participate and encourage this process so I can make their clients my clients.
And you want to put that in writing.
If you are concerned about a process, I litigated a dispute years ago, which was contentious about a book purchase or a purported book purchase, depending on your perspective of the case. And the buyer was very upset that the seller wasn't really doing what he was asking. Like, hey, I want you to do this. When you meet with the client, I want you to say the following and then stop talking and let me run with it. None of that worked out.
Oh.
If it had been set forth in the documents, in the consulting agreement, in a transition plan, step 1, step 2, this is what I'm expecting. I expect you to be available Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Whatever those expectations are, you may want to think about memorializing it, because the more that's there, the more honest we have a deal we have in terms of our expectations.
So interesting. So that's also, if you, and you might want to rewind that and listen to it again, because as I'm listening to that, I actually threw my hat on as a buyer and thought, that's what I need to do.
Yeah.
Right? Because as a buyer, you're buying this practice, you're buying an asset, and you want to make sure that it converts, right? Yep. Most times, this is also a great reason why when you're doing a deal, in order for the seller to get the price that they want, a lot of times you do more of a seller's note, right? Which means the seller has to perform. So if you're buying a practice, understand that if you want the seller to perform, basically what Matt is saying is put it in writing. What is it exactly that I want to do, want you to do, and how, and what cadence, and what are my expectations?
Yep.
Because I do see that, right? I see sometimes they say, listen, you can stay on for as long as you want, just be around in case a client wants to talk to you. Well, that means a lot of things to different people, right? Like,
Yep.
hey, I was around. I was up on a mountain. I couldn't get signal, but I was around.
I answered your call within 24 hours.
Right. You just called me at a bad time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Versus be available Monday through Friday between the hours of whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Some reasonable amount of time, right?
Yep.
That's interesting because, you're getting a partner or selling your practice is not like opening up a joint account or a joint rep code with somebody.
No.
A joint rep code you can unwind. It's pretty easy.
Well, I've dealt with some disputes over that.
Yeah,
too.
right, exactly. Well, we've been both around a long time. So when I say easy, it's in relative terms, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, it's easy. But once you sign on a dotted line, there's like no givebacks, right? Unless you have something in there
Correct.
where you have some type of out.
These are very challenging transactions to unwind.
Right.
And I can't, we've had so many instances of advisors who sell their practices for amounts of money that could make your eyes pop.
Yeah.
And they'll tell you a year in they're miserable. Because it was the wrong fit. It was the wrong place. They're making them do things with clients they don't like. The senior partner in the group isn't doing what they said they would do, and the juniors are upset. On and on. You could name every iteration.
So we've done some podcasts about that in the past. So
Yeah.
Stacey Frank and I did some of those things. And we were using PE firms as an example, but it doesn't have to be a PE firm.
Yeah.
Right? And I've warned advisors before, don't get enamored with just the money. I hate to say that the money will always be there, but if you have a good practice, you'll always have value in your business. So be really, really mindful about the person you're selling the practice to, because it's hard to unwind. And don't fall in love with the biggest offer, because it's usually the biggest offer for a reason, right? Understand, peel the onion back, ask the tough questions. And I agree with you. If you have a buyer that's not willing to answer those questions, walk away, right?
Or you may want to give serious thought to what you're selling, or you acknowledge, I'm selling out, and this is a big number, and I know that I'm owned by them, and I'm agreeing to that.
Right, exactly.
And I'm non-judgmental about that if that's your decision.
That's okay too.
Right.
But right, exactly. But understand that.
Yeah.
We're working with a large client right now, and we've had several conversations, and the deals keep falling apart.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, it's not because of the seller. The seller has been over the top transparent about what they want. Literally, we don't want you to change how we run money for our clients for the last 40 years. This is how we do it. These are the models. Really transparent.
And you can inherently see why a lot of firms would be turned off by that.
Right. And so what happens is these firms come in and they go, we're good. They want to get to the table.
Yeah.
And then when it gets close to the end, the truth comes out, because they have these real conversations, and then the deal falls apart.
Exactly.
And so I guess we're on this last pot, what we're talking about, Healer, is just be transparent.
Yep.
Overtly transparent.
Of course.
It's as a seller, it's never going to be the last opportunity that you have to sell your practice. And as a buyer, I'll say this to a buyer, practices that are for sale are a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
They're everywhere. Our firm works with sellers all the time. We get multiple new people looking to sell their practices every single day. Be careful what you wish for, right?
Yep.
This would be the last thing on this topic, because it just came to mind.
Sure.
Because I've had these situations before.
Oh, yeah.
Where, as a buyer, if you have a seller that says basically they're going to sell and they're out, make sure that's in writing.
That's right.
Because what you don't want is you take over a practice and you're buying, let's say you're buying a transactional practice for the most part, and you're buying it because you know that you can convert it to advisory and take it from $300,000 to $800,000.
Yep.
Just using simple math. But you have a seller that sticks around too long and undermines you with every conversation. He's been a trader our whole life together for 20 years. He's never going to convert to advisory, blah, blah, blah. And then, because when you talk to the client about converting, he's going to call that the seller up and say, "Hey, Bob, what do you think?" Right? Yeah, you don't need to do that.
Right.
And it's going to be detrimental to your investment.
And Bob's probably violating his agreement in some capacity.
Right. Well, I've told that to advisors.
Yeah.
Like, they're like, "Oh, I'm going to sell." I said, "Okay, you understand when you do that, you can't talk to your clients ever again about investments." Like,
unless you're allowed to, but yeah.
But no, I'm saying, like, because
Right.
they're like, "Oh, I'm out."
Yeah.
Okay. So your biggest client, who's your best friend,
Yeah.
when you're playing golf and he asks you about what stocks are you buying or whatever, you have to tell him, "I can't talk to you about it."
Yeah.
Because you're going to violate whatever agreement you went into in order to
Exactly.
get the money that you got.
Yep.
And then a lot of times they're like, "Oh, I didn't know that."
Yeah, and I think my last point on that whole contract pitfall piece is, and it dovetails a little bit with what I said originally, is making sure things are memorialized that you really care about, that are material. But I think the dovetail of that piece as well is, make sure that whatever you're doing and whoever you're dealing with, the documents ultimately reflect what you believe you're getting, what you believe you're negotiating.
Right.
Because so often you think you're getting X, Y, or Z. And
thought.
that's not how revenue is defined in the agreement, or that's not how assets are. You need to make sure it reflects the underlying business reality of what you think it says.
Right. Yeah. The term "I thought"
Right.
doesn't hold water.
Not after you have an integration clause and signed the documents and sold the business.
Right.
Often.
So, bottom line here is, if you're going through this process, candidly, as a buyer or a seller, if you're not working with a really good attorney, there's a high likelihood you're going to end up in hot water in some form or fashion. So you need to speak to somebody. Preferably, you can speak to Matt. Matt, why don't you just give him I know it's early on in the show, but what's the best number from the call?
Sure. My office number is 212-878-1429. My email is mbaum@foxrothschild.com. It's ROTHSCHILD.com.
Right. And we'll have all that, and we'll say it again, but we'll have all that
Yep.
in the bio. So I want to switch gears for a second, because I
Please.
think we've beaten that one up. Probably some buyers going, "Man, I'm not going to buy any practices. This sounds dangerous."
Hopefully they're still listening.
Hopefully, exactly. It's not all that dangerous. You just have to know what you're doing. So, or work with a firm and an attorney that knows what they're doing.
Yep.
The next component I want to talk about is sort of like, I guess it's the opposite of being a buyer or a seller, right? And that is this issue that we're seeing with what do advisors do when they've either been asked to leave a firm, outright terminated?
Yep.
We're seeing, for some reason, well, I shouldn't say for some reason, I've been doing this long enough that this sort of happens towards the end of the year more so than any other part of the time, right? But what I'm actually seeing more now than ever before, not necessarily the terminations,
Yep.
because we always see terminations, but now firms are basically knocking on the doors of these advisors, and we're not talking about just W-2 advisors.
Yeah.
Right? Well, I'm seeing a huge pickup in independent advisors, and I'm not going to name firms because I think it's happening across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And they're basically telling advisors, or asking advisors nicely, to leave.
Yeah.
Right? In those situations, what are the things that those types of advisors need to be really concerned about? And I'm an advisor, that happens to me.
Mm-hmm.
What are the first few things I should be doing and be concerned about once that person leaves my office and I go, "What just happened?"
Yep. So step one, and this is one, I'm not putting myself first, I'm putting you first. You need to find a new home. Like, you need to be searching for that new home immediately, because you don't know what's about to happen. They may separate you. They may have told you it's time for a new home. Maybe you're under internal review and you think it may head towards a termination. Getting a new home is paramount in terms of porting your book to the extent you're able to do so. So if you don't have that backstop, if they terminate you and you have nowhere to go, that's not so great. So you want to get speaking with recruiters or get in front of firms and otherwise, so you could start that process. Number two.
But doesn't that process, won't most firms, this is sort of a softball question.
Yeah, I'll take softballs.
Won't most of those firms not want to have a conversation or not want to go down the road with that advisor because there's going to be some type of window of time where the advisor may or may not be able to be registered? So you're saying they should still go through that process
100%,
anyway.
because a lot of firms may not commit to an advisor fully, and they'll say, we got to see what the U5 language looks like. We're not going to give you that affiliation offer. We're not going to bring you on board until that U5 is filed. And firms have 30 days to file that U5, right?
Right.
And then what is the reason for the termination? The reason could be very impactful on you in multiple ways. One, finding a new home. Certain firms are more accepting of certain sales practice violations than others. Some firms will say if it's sales practice, we're not going to touch you. That's just the way it is. If it's HR related, depending on how severe, may be easier to find a new home because they'll say, look, it's not threatening customers. It's not something FINRA is as concerned about in context. Maybe that advisor's not going to have an expected regulatory piece to whatever happened in the termination underlying. But getting in front of firms and talking about this is what's going on, this is my business or my book of business that I service, however you want to define it. And, will you affiliate me under these circumstances and what does that look like? Getting that conversation open gets you to the point that when you are terminated, you're hopefully very close to actually getting that done.
Okay.
The second piece you have to be very concerned about is your U5. What's it going to say? Now, you can always try to file an arbitration to ultimately expunge something or having it modified, but that's a whole process unto itself, and that could shut you down practically for a year or longer, and maybe you won't get that expungement. The grounds are very severe to get expungement.
Right.
Your better step is to try to speak with the firm immediately about what are you thinking in terms of the U5. Firms are obligated to truthfully and accurately list the reasons for termination, but you and I could say the same thing 200 different ways that's still truthful and accurate,
right?
But the language may be somewhat preferable.
Should they be doing that on their own, or should they immediately get an attorney?
Self-servingly, I think it's better to have counsel for a variety of reasons.
That was a trick question, by the way.
No, I understand. but I try to be fair and balanced,
right,
Frank,
right.
Not totally promotional.
Exactly.
So, yes, you're better off having counsel who actually is experienced in the space because they'll either have dealt with that firm before and they may know what that firm may be willing to do. Some firms will say, we won't talk to you about the language. We're going to do what we're going to do.
Right.
Other firms will say, this is what we're thinking. If you have alternative language, we'll consider it.
Right.
And that's where it really occurs and where you might get some value in terms of just a better way of saying the same thing. It's not a panacea. The regulators still may look into you and the underlying facts are what they are regardless of that license, but certain firms may be more comfortable affiliating you to their platform if the language is softer.
Right. We just had the reason why I brought this up is because in the last, 2 or 3 weeks, I think we've had 3 of these.
Yeah.
Right. Where
terms or you're under review?
No.
Or
just
there's the door?
Hey, listen, we don't think this is a good home for you anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
But there's got to be a reason. Meaning it still has to be performance based.
Yeah. Well, I know one in particular was it was a decent sized book of business. Excuse me. The decent sized book of business, like a $700,000 producer.
Yeah.
But he was 80% transaction.
I see.
Right.
Which
and his ROA wasn't crazy for being a transaction book, right?
Yeah.
He had a lot of assets.
Right.
But maybe he was 1.5-ish times, right?
Got it.
And one of the things that we are working on with him is in that situation, if you're terminated for cause, you sort of had less wiggle room with what you can sort of negotiate, right? But what I'm focused on, because I think a lot of advisors are worried about this, is the knock on the door, we don't think you're cut for us anymore. Maybe it's lower producers, someone that's trying to make their numbers look better and they're trying to get their average production up, so they're getting rid of guys doing 250, 300,000. That's what we see a lot of, is those types of producers. But they're still their livelihood and we have to take care of them. So in those situations, what are ways that they can sort of minimize the blow on the CRD in terms of being asked to leave, permitted to resign, or versus voluntary resignation versus terminated?
And it has to be truthful, right? So if the firm basically says you're terminated, you have a month, that's what happened. That's the an attorney, I don't care who they are, can't sprinkle magic fairy dust and say, well, that was completely voluntary. Maybe not. Maybe you were permitted to resign under that circumstance, depending on how they.
We had one of those too.
Right. So that part is a little more challenging as opposed to the actual language that gets posted.
Right.
And whether it's voluntary, involuntary, you may have an opportunity to be heard on that. Many firms have a practice of sending you the U5. This is what we're intending to file in a week.
Right.
If you have any comments, let us know.
Right.
So you may be encouraged, in fact, to come back to the firm and say, listen, I don't think this is truthful about what happened, because in that situation, maybe the stated reason is performance didn't meet expectations.
Right.
Or something nebulous like that.
I think that sometimes when I get phone calls, and I can think of one story, I get phone calls from advisors when there's been a change of something happened.
Like an acquisition or something at the firm?
All of a sudden the firm picked up an email from them on something, and something happened where the advisor knows in their gut, this is not good.
Yeah.
Right? Nothing's happened yet,
Yep.
but they know like, it's not good.
Yeah.
And then, because this has happened multiple times, and I wish that everyone would listen, when I say to them, that's not good,
Yeah.
you need to leave.
Yep.
And they think it's self-serving because they think that I want to move them and whatever, right?
Sure.
And to a degree, yeah, I get paid, but I'm giving them really good advice.
Yep.
Like, you need to move before the firm takes action. And I had a situation, so this is basically a warning to everybody listening. If it smells funny, right? Your manager comes into your office and says, "Hey, listen, it's not a." As soon as they say it's not a big deal,
Yeah.
right? When they start off with "it's not a big deal," it's a big deal,
Yeah.
right? But I had a situation where, and this gentleman was at an independent firm,
Yeah.
and something happened. I don't get into the details, and I said, I'll just call him Bob. Bob, you need to leave, right? No, they're this, that. They said it's not a big problem. And to his credit, or to my credit, I convinced him to at least have conversations with firms.
Yep.
Right? And he was.
Yeah.
But he stayed too long. And then he got to, we're giving you 30 days and then we're terminating you.
Yeah.
Call.
Yeah.
Right?
Which you anticipated at the start.
I knew that was going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And it was like 6 months, right?
Yeah.
And every single firm, without question,
Yeah.
took that as he was terminated.
Right. Yep.
Not like he was asked to leave nicely and he's a nice guy. You were terminated. They just gave you
Yep.
30 days to do it.
And that's the
Right?
sensitive piece completely.
Right.
Because as you even rightfully predicted in that situation, Bob may be right. Maybe at the end of the day they do nothing and there was a little friction and they moved past it. That could happen. But do you want to take that chance?
It was a multi-million-dollar bet.
And that's the key. Exactly.
Because he went
Like,
from getting
great way of putting it.
He went from getting real deals
Yep.
on a real book of business
To you're lucky we're showing you a
to
home.
next to nothing.
Yeah.
Basically, hey, listen, you're lucky that we're willing to bring you on in less than 30 days.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And
And look,
it was
you're always in a
really costly.
Yeah, you're always in a much more powerful leverage position if you're employed somewhere and trying to find a new job than you're not.
Right.
Or you've been
And-
shown the door already.
Yeah, and I just wish, I'm talking to our advisors, I just wish you would pay attention, and the firms aren't going to like what I'm about to say here. They don't care about you. Like, they don't, it's CYA, right? I'll say cover your own broker, like CYB, right? They look at your revenue and then they look at the issues that they may or may be facing, and they think to themselves, is it worth the risk for the money they're making on you, which is usually not a lot, right, to take that kind of risk for whatever it is? And they most times opt to, it's not worth the risk.
Yeah, and I'll say it a little bit differently than you said it, Frank. Like,
Not as
the
direct
firms,
and hot.
yeah, exactly. Like, the firms may care about you, but they have their own interests at
Right,
heart.
right.
And they have their own agenda, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's business. It's like talking about the M&A, right? Buyer has certain interests, seller has certain interests. If it's private equity backed, private equity has their own interests. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just business. But it's always business at the end of the day.
Right.
And business doesn't always have feelings. So
Yeah,
it
and
just...
what I think that advisors, where they get caught up in the emotional side of it,
Yeah.
like, well, yeah, but maybe it'll work out. I'll say most times. A lot of times it doesn't, and we've seen a lot of stuff. And then we also, talk to attorneys.
Yeah.
This is another. I'll get into that in a second, but there's so much money on the line.
Yeah.
That, and I've covered this in a previous podcast, that most of the broker deal, not just the independent broker dealer world, right? They're more or less the same, right? Plus or minus a couple of platform things, and maybe some of the pricing is a little bit different. But when you talk about the main firms that are out there that we all hear, the LPLs and Mosaics and Ceteras and whatever, they're more or less the same. The difference is if you make a move and you have control of the process and you have control of the situation, it's going to put a lot of money in your pocket. Yeah, you're going to go through some aggravation to make the move, but I can promise you it's a lot less aggravation than when you get the phone call and they give you 30 days to leave, and no matter how you spin it, like Matt, what you're talking about, no matter how you spin, we're giving you 30 days.
All they heard is you were fired.
All they heard is you were fired.
Right. And
Right.
and frankly, from the lawyer perspective, it's plan for the worst, right? Hope for the best,
Hope for
but
the
plan
best.
for the worst.
Right.
Be ready.
Right. So in those cases, you would advise, even if they think nothing's going to happen, again, self-serving, it's okay, because we're trying to give them advice here, that they should pick up the phone and call you. And even if our consults.
You should run it by counsel in the space who actually has experience, not your college buddy who's a real estate attorney, like someone who actually knows the space and the industry and the ramifications. Every fact pattern's unique, I will say that. And the fact patterns matter. Really understanding what happened, what do you know, who'd you speak with, what'd they ask you about. Really getting into the weeds helps inform what your next move should be.
Interesting. Okay, so again, I think we've beaten that one up.
Yep.
I see it all the time, and
Likewise.
Look, the benefit to me is what I really enjoy is that some of these advisors come to me and they think that their life's over.
Yeah.
Right, and then I'm able to help them. Right.
Yep.
And so it doesn't mean you can't go to someplace.
Yep.
There's some really good firms, like you said, that will look at the situation and there's certain things that are unacceptable. But the biggest difference is it may be you going to the same place that you were going to go to before, but no money. Right?
Much worse deal.
Much worse deal. Because they have the control now.
Yeah, leverage. It's like any negotiation. Who has the leverage?
Right. So just don't do that. The other thing that those are two hot topics.
Yeah.
The other thing that I want to talk about, which is maybe way off to the side.
Sure.
But it's something that, speaking of, maybe not off to the side, because I can totally see advisors getting fired for this.
Yep.
Right?
Okay.
And that is the use of AI.
Sure.
I love it. I'm like obsessed with it.
Big chat BTer.
Yeah, I'm a big chat BTer, and I joke with my assistant that, man, this is really good. I can have an assistant do this stuff, and maybe, so we joke about it. But anyway,
sure.
I love her. She's fine. But we use some of it on our marketing, and we use a lot of that. But in financial services, it can be really dangerous.
Yes.
And so, from your perspective, how do you see AI? I'll just call it, not ChatGPT, but because there's all different ones, right? But how do you see it being used the right way, and what are the things that advisors should be really careful about?
Yeah. So I think, and I'm certainly no expert on the topic of AI, I think we're all learning as the generative process occurs, and it evolves every second. As we've had this conversation, it's evolved onto a whole nother thing.
I explained this to my my CFO, who's younger, he's in his early 30s. I said, it's like when I was pointing to me, when I was in the business as an advisor in the 90s, and this thing called AOL came out.
Yeah.
We were all trying to figure it out. Like, what does this do?
Yeah.
What do you mean the internet?
Yep. And you had the dial-up modem and all the sound.
Yeah, right. It's the same thing.
Yep.
Like, what is this? So I view it the same way.
Exactly.
Right. And there was a huge learning curve.
It's novel for everyone. It's novel for advisors. It's novel for regulators. Everyone is getting up to speed on this. But some areas, if we want to talk about danger zone and like parade of horribles, just not to scare anyone, but just to keep it real.
I like that term, parade of horribles.
If we look at that, let's talk about fraud for a moment, right? If generative AI can basically listen to your podcasts and recreate your voice. They know your inflections. They know how you speak. They know how you say certain words, like pronouncing my last name at the beginning of this, on and on and on and on. They can create you, or something that looks very, very similar and sounds very similar to you, right? And picture a wire transfer, right? What would be the worst thing to happen to an advisor beyond sending money to the wrong account and not being able to get it back for a client? Like, you get a wire transfer and you send it out to some crook, right? Or some third party or some fraudster. That is really scary stuff. And what do firms have in place? Often you have to do a writing to sign off that you asked for this wire, and a verbal confirmation.
Verbal confirmation.
Well, if I've got your voice and I'm doing the verbal confirmation with that, how does the sales assistant or the advisor, whoever's facilitating this wire, know it? I think fraudsters that will be utilizing AI will be very scary for the landscape. I think firms are going to have to deal with it on some level. Mm-hmm. I don't have the solution, certainly. That's a technology issue in part, and how you vet that stuff or what other controls you put in place. But I could see fraud across the board in terms of taking money out of accounts, transferring brokerage accounts to other accounts, those types of things, getting money in a criminal's hands. I think that's very scary stuff.
One idea that I had heard, because this does happen, and I actually had a situation, I don't know if it was AI, but where somebody, I don't know who it was, hijacked my email to one of the firms that we do business with.
Yeah.
And I didn't know, And luckily, they called me to confirm that I wasn't moving my bank account to Chase.
Yep.
Right.
Can you imagine?
Right. And it was a 6-figure.
Yeah.
Right. It was so thank God. Right.
Yeah.
But I do agree that, in an advisor's world, Mrs. Jones calls, or someone that sounds like Mrs. Jones.
Yep.
And you make that wire transfer. So one of the ideas that I had heard, is not my idea, so I'm not like a genius.
Sure.
Is that if you're an advisor and you have that situation, have a secret word.
Right.
Right. Like something.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Have some secret word.
Yeah.
That when you open up, when you start an engagement with a client, you give them that word, and have that secret word different for everybody. So
that's interesting. It's like a mantra with TM.
Right. So
everyone's got their unique
thing. So, you just don't know what it could be. But and whatever. If you take that idea, don't make it like their grandchildren's names.
Right. Like when your password is password.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. Make it some unique name, unique password that only you and your assistant.
Yeah.
And then you tell your client, because then when you get that phone call and you let them know why, and they'll appreciate that you're protecting them.
Yep.
Right. Because once that money goes out to Yugoslavia, wherever it's going, I'm not saying Yugoslavia, but wherever, it's gone.
Exactly. It's scary.
Yeah, and I had a client 2 years ago, had to get rid of his assistant for over like a 25-year assistant because that happened.
That's a shame.
Now they don't know if it wasn't AI fake,
Understood.
but it was fraud.
Yeah.
And she didn't do it the right way, and it was like $600,000.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, another area, and it's not as scary, I guess, as fraud, is papering what you're doing. It's a paper-intensive business. A lot of financial advisors don't like the paperwork, but unfortunately, it's just a necessary evil in this space. And I think if you're researching securities, for example, and you're trying to make recommendations to clients, and you're utilizing AI, let's say you utilize an AI tool to like scan a 10K, right? And let you know what are the real risks associated with this investment, or however you're harnessing that technology to make recommendations. What did you do to vet that AI is spitting out accurate information? The risks are really known, that you documented it. At the end of the day, what's AI working off of? Data sets, right? What do you know about the data set? What tire kicking did you do on the data set? I think vendor management's going to be a big issue in terms of how you're using customer information alongside AI, and whether you're commingling a confidential client information into a pool that could be captured by third parties.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like those risks inherent with documenting what you're reviewing to make recommendations, how you're using AI with client information, maybe to make recommendations, maybe to do other things, manage a portfolio, balance whatever.
I didn't think about that part with like doing, 10Ks or whatever.
Yeah. Just
research a Morningstar analysis and compare this Morningstar fund to this Morningstar fund. I think that they call that, my Salesforce, she's like a wizard. She calls it hallucinations.
Right.
They're not always right. It's
correct.
Interestingly enough, we're trying this because we're trying to put as much through our chat as we can just to learn.
Yeah.
Right. And so my CFO put some data into this thing and said, analyze such and such, right?
Yep.
And he had some idea of the answer, which is the key point. And it comes back with something that was off.
Yep.
And he responded like you're talking to somebody like, hey, I don't think you're using the right such and such calculation.
Yep.
It actually said, oh, you're right.
Yeah.
Like it admitted it was wrong.
Yeah.
And so I guess if you're an advisor, like just don't take it for face value. Play with it. Like it can get you somewhere. It can get you to a certain point.
Yep.
My son is an attorney, or is soon to be an attorney, right?
Oh, congrats.
Thank
and
you.
I'm sorry all at the same time.
So third year law student at Rutgers.
That's great. Congrats.
And he was telling me that you guys use, I forget the name of what he called it, Lexus AI or something.
Yep.
And it'll help you pull in case studies and stuff like that. But you still have to go in and make sure that it's fitting what you're looking for, and not just take it right.
It reminds me of like anyone who went to school, right? Maybe use Spark Notes, Cliff Notes, whatever. That's not a substitute for reading the book. A lot of people utilize that,
right?
But there's a lot missing.
Yeah.
Right? By definition, it's not complete. It's a summary. It's someone's subjective summary.
Right.
So
aside from fraud, and I'm not going to say you know what FINRA's perspective is, because who knows, right?
Sure.
But what are the main things that they're most concerned, aside from fraud, where they're concerned about where an advisor can get into trouble?
I think that, I don't speak for FINRA, so let's start there.
I get that.
But based on podcasts that FINRA puts out and some things that I've read, I think fraud is a big concern. I think commingling of data is a big concern. Like if you're utilizing AI tools and you're commingling that data, client data that other parties can potentially capture, that's scary. I think even this issue of research and how you're vetting investment opportunities for clients, whether you're just clicking a button and saying, well, AI told me it's okay, so this is my recommendation, versus making sure the data sets that underlie that are accurate or somehow reliable or aren't missing something.
Okay.
I think those are going to be really key areas, but I always go back to documentation, right? Are you documenting what you're doing? Are you reviewing what you're doing? Do you have confidence in the tool you're utilizing, right? If I use a calculator that doesn't work, my numbers are always going to come out incorrectly. It's kind of like using an AI tool that has a flaw in it.
Right.
Have you really vetted it to make sure it works?
Right. What about like client communication, advertising and marketing, as our...
Oh, aside from AI, you're saying?
No, but sort of in the realm of AI. So we have a marketing company called Elite Marketing Concepts, and so we deal with this sometimes where firms are reluctant to want to use AI to create, I'll just call it advertisements.
Sure.
For whatever, everything under the sun advertisements, right? Why do you feel like that's such a problem unless they basically use it through AI, create it to just send it out, which we don't recommend?
Yeah.
But where do you think the issues are with that when using basically advertising and client communication?
Yeah, and I think often thinking about, is the communication accurate? Is the communication truthful? Is it misleading in some way?
Got it.
And I think that's really where a regulator is going to get exercise. Like, what you are doing, are you misleading people in some way? Are you somehow inferring that you can obtain a certain type of result? Are you not inferring that? Are you guaranteeing something when you really shouldn't be guaranteeing something? So the question is whether or not the tool is being vetted sufficiently to make sure that you're not inadvertently making a recommendation, saying something that's misleading to the investing public, giving advice that people rely on, hence why we do disclosures in our conversation even.
Right.
I think those are the types of areas that FINRA is going to be very interested in. And the misleading part can't necessarily with AI, and this is sort of the hard part to balance, can't necessarily determine, is this misleading? Because if you don't really know what's underlying why AI crafted what it did, can you even vet whether it's misleading or not, potentially? Right. And also, I think just practically as the regulators, it's going to be challenging for them to monitor all of this because it's going to be in abundance.
Look, they're going to run through the same issue that they started running into when the internet came out. It sounds silly to say that.
Right. Well, didn't Al Gore invent it? Exactly.
Kidding, of course. But look, so it was, and I say this jokingly, but not jokingly. Like when AOL, when the internet came out, like it was a problem.
Yep.
Right. And then email.
Yep.
And then cell phones. How do you deal with client communication? Look, some firms are a little bit draconian with it today, right? But now there's texting, and we won't get into it in the interest of time, but texting has become a problem.
Yep.
And I think that advisors don't understand that texting with a client is client communication.
Right.
And when your client is blowing off steam and he's like, my Microsoft stock's down or whatever, he's just blowing off steam.
Yep.
Technically, a firm can take that as a client complaint. And so you have to be really careful about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the texting has been beaten to death, certainly in the space, and most firms at this point are requiring advisors, to the extent they hadn't previously, to put it all through, and they have capture software and all of that. And then in certain ways, it is up to A, the advisor on the front line, and B, next level compliance to pick up on those communications to see if there's a complaint in the works and otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's on everyone to vet that.
So just be careful. Look, we covered a lot of, in my opinion, I think we covered 3 areas that are really hot topics. I'd love to have you back on again.
Anytime.
There's so much more stuff that we can talk about.
Absolutely.
So the highway to the danger zone, not that I want to be a negative Nelly, but practices are worth a lot of money.
Yes.
And they have a lot of value to the financial advisor. Aside from their family, obviously, it's probably their most valuable assets, and they need to protect it.
Yep.
And so I really appreciate your time here. That was a lot to unpack. So again, if an audience wants to reach you and get in contact with you, what's the best way to reach you via either call or email?
Yeah, so my direct line is 212-878-1429, and my email is mbaum@foxrothschild.com.
Awesome. And of course, you can always DM me on my Instagram account at franklarosa.elite, or you can shoot me an email at frank@eliteconsultingpartners.com. You give me a call at 856-316-4651. What I try to do when I get phone calls from folks that are sort of chewing on, do I have a legal problem or do I not have a legal problem?
Yeah.
I've been doing this for 30 years, so I've seen a lot of different things. You want to give me a call, I'll give you the straight shot. If I think that it's something that you need to be worried about, definitely, I've seen everything. So, and 9 times out of 10, I'm like, yeah, go get an attorney. At least talk to one. It's worth a couple $1,000 to have a conversation, because that could save you, like in the case before, millions of dollars.
Yeah, and by the way, it's peace of mind. Instead of musing, should I get a little bit, get
Right.
peace of mind. Try to really understand what you're facing, what the ramifications are. And even if it doesn't look good, even if you speak with experienced counsel, you're not feeling great about the prospects, at least you don't have to wonder now. You kind of know this is where I stand, and I have to navigate this situation.
Right, and then these are the steps that I need to take. And so that's what we're really talking about, is getting out in front of these things is the most important component of this. Yep. So anyway, with that said, thanks for joining the show, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you have someone that is going through a situation, obviously share this podcast. Share Matt's phone number and email. Reach out to him. Matt and his firm they work with some of the best firms out in the industry, and those firms look to them for their advice and guidance on legal issues, and candidly use you as some of their representation for clients. So they've clearly been vetted. For those of you that are maybe don't understand, Fox Rothschild is one of the top law firms in the country, and so we're honored to have him on the show. And I appreciate you listening. I hope this helped. I hope it didn't. Well, maybe I hope it scared you a little bit.
That's not the goal, but be prepared, right?
Just be prepared, right? Exactly. So anyway, with that said, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Advisor Talk with Frank LaRosa. If you're looking for more advice or solutions on any topics in the financial services industry, or you just want to subscribe to our podcast, head on over to eliteconsultingpartners.com/podcasts.